In a recent members live stream, we covered loads and loads of topics, but one of the topics that seemed to get more airtime than anything was the problem of missed bites. We're seeing on lots of venues now where there's more and more people starting to target small fish. You know, we all know how unpredictable targeting bigger fish can be, and it can often be a case of if you're not drawn on the bigger fish, then there's no point in targeting them. So we're constantly looking at ways of trying to find ways of making up the weights that we need in our matches, and you know, quite often that means targeting silverfish and smaller fish because they tend to be a little bit more spread out and a little bit more reliable. However, one of the problems that goes hand in hand with targeting small fish is missed bites, you know, and there can be several different reasons why you're actually missing bites, and it's something I keep getting asked over and over again. And now we're just getting to the back end of this year. We've already seen that this year there's been lots of you that have been out there on venues like Staunton Harold and some of these open water reservoirs, and particularly the anglers that have been going to Ireland to compete in festivals. They are targeting smaller fish generally at short range, but feeding can be a massive part of targeting small fish. But like I said before, because you're targeting small fish, they tend to be there in numbers, and that can lead to all sorts of problems, and missed bites is obviously making you much more inefficient. We all know from speed fishing, we've talked about it many times on this channel, that if you can come back with a fish every cast, you're going to be making yourself incredibly difficult to beat. If someone is going to beat you and you're catching a fish every single cast, the only two ways that they can do that is either A, to catch them quicker, or B, to target bigger fish. And as we've just discussed, bigger fish are much more unreliable and unpredictable as well. So if you can come back with a fish every cast, then that's the ideal scenario. So when you're getting bites, if you're already getting bites, you've solved a massive problem there, because if you are getting bites, you know, I see a lot of people get disheartened about missing bites. If you are missing bites, there are so many pluses that you've already worked out. You know, you must be using the right bait because the fish are obviously eating that bait, otherwise you wouldn't be getting the bites. You must be on the right line because obviously the fish are there, you know. So and if it's a question of your ground bait mix or anything like that, then obviously there are so many boxes that are already ticked if you're already getting bites. Now what I have been asked to do is just kind of bullet point the things that we go through when we are faced with the problem of missing bites. Okay, so there is pretty much a checklist of things that we go through, and I don't think I've ever been in a position where I've never found the reason for missed bites, you know. And one of the things that you've got to remember is that if you are missing bites, there will always be a way around it. There will always be a way of turning those bites into hooked fish. And trust me, you know, some of the best anglers in the world who I'm fortunate enough to mix with, they will find a way. You know, they always find a way. It might take them a while, and it might take quite a few things to be eliminated first, but they will find a way. So just be very confident that there will be something. It could be the element of your rig, it could be the feeder you're using, it could be the hook bait, it could be the size of hook, and those are the things that we go through as regards an actual checklist. So that's what this upload is all about. It's just about bullet pointing those things that we go through when we're faced with the problem of missed bites. Now for me, the first thing would be, generally, I like to do the things that don't unless I've got a really strong gut feeling, or if I've seen that scenario before and I think I know exactly what the problem is, I will go straight to that problem and make that change. However, if you don't really know what the problem is and you are going to have to go through the list of trying to find out what's going to solve the problem, then I always start with the things first that mean that you don't have to make any immediate changes to your rig and to your setup. Okay, I like to do the other things first. So the first thing that I would generally do is change the way that you're positioning your tip. Sometimes the best way to catch particularly roach and small fish might be you need a bend in the tip. Okay, and sometimes that just means that you might be turning it into a little bit more of a bolt rig. However, on the flip side of that, sometimes slack lining is the best thing to do. So that is always my first point of call, because I don't have to change anything to do that. You know, I can just simply cast out again, and it's just the case of the way that you position your rod and the way that you tighten up to your feeder. So that's the first thing you always do. It's the tension on the tip. Okay, so sometimes you might need to have it really tight, sometimes just a little bit of a bend in the tip, and sometimes you have to slacken it right off so it's completely just slack lining. Basically, you're giving the fish more time to take your bait in before it registers on the tip. So that's the first thing. The next thing I would do is, if I'm missing bites, I would then start to look at the other things. The other things like feeding. I would start to try and concentrate the fish down on the bottom. Okay, so quite often missed bites generally mean that there's a lot of fish there, so it might be a case that you're getting a bite as soon as the feeder hits the bottom. If that's the case, it generally means that the fish are up in the water, and it means they are competing for the food. So what the next thing I would do is quite simply think about the way that you're introducing the ground bait. Think about the way that you're packing your feeder. I would immediately switch to packing the ground bait in much tighter into the feeder. What that will do is it will encourage the ground bait to only empty right down on the bottom. If you can get the fish down on the bottom, feeding off the bottom, it is going to make them easier to catch. Okay, and it might mean that you've got to change your feeder to do that. If you're using a fine wire cage feeder, you might find that particularly if you're in deep water, that feeder won't allow the ground bait to be packed in too tight, because sometimes with a fine wire mesh ground bait feeder, the more you pack the ground bait in, the more it squeezes out of the holes, the bait and the ground bait and everything. So think about changing your feeder. You might want to switch to a solid plastic feeder or a plastic open-ended feeder, something that's much more enclosed, something that's going to encourage the bait to only empty on the bottom. So that'll be the next step. The steps after that, I would think about how much bait I was actually putting in. Okay, so the next one will be to just cut back a little bit on the feed. Because you've got fish there, it obviously means they're eating the bait. It means that they are enjoying the bait. They obviously want it, and it means they're competing for it. However, sometimes there might be too much feed there for the number of fish that are there, and sometimes that can mean that the fish aren't really fully committing to the hook bait. Sometimes if there's an abundance of bait there, fish can suck bait in and out. They're not really competing for it because they know there's plenty of it, and sometimes that means that they're not really committing every single time to the hook bait. So I would then cut back on the feed. What that will do then, that will then increase the competition for the bait that is there. So if there are 40 fish there, for example, and you suddenly cut back to 5 maggots every cast, well, all of a sudden there are 5 maggots there and 40 fish. Those fish are going to have to compete and commit to those 5 maggots, otherwise they're not going to get fed. And that could be something that's just going to completely transform the way that you bites. That can make your bites much more confident because the fish are committing to the bait. So they're the first steps. And they're the first steps that you can do without changing anything on your rig. Okay, and if you found out the solution by this stage, then happy days, everything's all right, you're happily catching fish. The only word of warning I've got for you is that if you do get to stage 3 where you're cutting back on the feed, just be very, very aware of what's happening in your swim. Sometimes you might find that yes, cutting back on the feed will make the bites much more positive and mean the fish are going to commit to the bait more, but you might also find that there isn't enough feed going in to keep that number of fish in your swim. And what you might find is, and what we often see, particularly in match fishing, when you've got somebody either side of you, you can easily lose the fish. The fish could just simply go to the next peg where the next angler's putting more bait in. So you've got to be very, very aware of what's happening in your swim. And a typical scenario of that, it might be that within the next 5-6 casts you get great bites, but then it starts to slow down again. You need to be aware of that, because that might mean that you've got to start feeding heavy again to get the fish there and keep them there. So sometimes it's a nice fine balancing act. The next changes that we can do are the things that would involve your rig. Now the next one for me, I would take a serious look at the size of your hook in relation to your hook bait, and more importantly to the size of the fish that you're catching. Now I've been on scenarios, particularly in Ireland, where we've sometimes got away with size 10 hooks, even with a single maggot. I mean, it's something that's really unheard of in England, that sort of fishing. But there are times when you can actually get away with that. However, I have had occasions where I fished a single maggot on the number 10, which you'd think you'd hook every single fish. However, that only really applies to the fish that are of a certain size. So if you can imagine, if you were catching 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 ounce roach, then a size 10 hook you could possibly get away with, because those fish are a little bit bigger and they can obviously suck in a size 10 hook. However, if you were catching fish in the 1 to 2 ounce sort of bracket, like we often are, then a size 10 hook is a little bit too big for those fish to suck in. You know, a size 10 hook is quite a big hook for fish of that size, because those fish have only got smaller mouths. So whilst you might still be missing bites on the number 10, if you're catching fish in the 1 to 2 ounce bracket, you might find that possibly a size 14 might be better. So it's a very fine balancing act. So I would take a close look at my hook, try and match that to the hook bait that you're using, and more importantly to the stamp of fish that you're actually catching. And if I felt it was wrong, then I would immediately change it. That's why we carry lots of different variety of hook lengths tied up, so that we can quickly and easily change. The next thing I would look at if I was missing bites would then look at shortening the hook length. Quite often on some venues you need a hook length that might be 1 metre long. Sometimes it might even be longer than that. When the fish are up in the water, However, getting bites is obviously the first stage, but if you're getting bites but then missing them, then you know you're kind of defeating the object. It's great that you're getting bites, but if you're not putting fish in the net, then something's wrong. So that is when I would start to reduce the length of the hook length, and don't do it too dramatically. You know, you might find that, you know, if you're on a metre, for example, metre hook length, and you're missing bites, you might suddenly think that a 25 centimetre hook length might be better, or a 50. Don't go straight to that, because sometimes you quite find that you'll go straight to that extreme and then you don't get any bites at all. You're sure it's going to work, but it really doesn't, and then inevitably you end up putting a metre hook length back on just to start getting bites again, and it can be wasted downtime. You're much better off just gradually decreasing the length of it by possibly 10 centimetres at a time, because then you might find that, say, 75 centimetres is optimum, where if you've gone down to 50, you'd be missing out on lots of bites, particularly early bites and quick bites, and so you're going to be missing out on fish. So just be very, very careful about the way that you're actually reducing the length of your hook length. And then the other thing then is just to think about, if you're still missing bites, then always check the rig as well. I mean, that's something that we're constantly doing all the time. If you are missing bites, when you're reeling, just have a look at your rig. You know, if there are, it's quite often with skimmers that we see blobs of slime around the rig, around the swivel, around the feeder, around the hook length, and that's telling you that there's fish around the feeder, you know. And if you are getting those signs, it's telling you that there are line bites, or most of them are line bites. Reduce the length of your hook length and present your hook bait nearer to the feeder. It makes sense that when the feeder goes in, the fish are going to go to the feeder. Lots of people don't think about that, but if that's where the feed is, then why wouldn't they go straight there, straight to the source? So by presenting your hook bait much nearer to the feeder, it makes perfect sense, and that can quite often be the way to go. But those are the simple steps. Sometimes it might not be one of those things, sometimes it might be a combination of those things, and sometimes if all those things don't work, sometimes just coming a little bit closer in could help, into shallower water, because sometimes when fish are up in the water, it can make them very, very difficult to catch. Ultimately, you want the fish down on the bottom, and if you can get them there, it's going to make them much easier to catch. So for those of you that have been asking about this, I hope this bullet point here is actually helping you out, and it's just a case of just keep ringing the changes. Trust me, you know, I've never ever come across a scenario where one of those things there hasn't solved the problem of missed bites.